Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new to my channel, hello, my name is Gabby and welcome. If you've never been here before, never watched any of my videos, have no idea what I do here on my channel, I cover true crime cases, and all the cases that I cover are a little bit older. They're all basically 20 years or older, so if that's something that you might be interested in, maybe go down below, click that subscribe button, and also make sure to turn on the post notifications to be notified every time that I upload. Today we discuss a recently identified Jane Doe and a puzzling case that along the way encountered one roadblock after another. Despite finally identifying her, investigators are urging the public to come forward with any information they may be withholding so her case can finally have its full conclusion. We're going to be taking this one back to the year of 1982. On February 16th of 1982, in the city of Plainview in Hale County, Texas, the partially decomposed remains of a young woman were found on the side of the road. The Lubbock Police Department took it over from there. With so much wide open space, with so many fields that go on for acres, Texas has areas known for becoming dumping grounds for homicide victims, and this woman was immediately identified as being one. There was no doubt in authorities' minds that she was the victim of a homicide. Someone took her life. But before discovering that, they needed to find out who she was, which was no easy task. It was really the condition of her body that shook the community and investigators to their core. She had been found nude, with her hands tied behind her back with her bra. Her remains were in an extreme state of decomposition, but they were able to surprisingly gather fingerprints from her, which of course can help with the identification of an unknown individual, but when it came to possibly doing a composite sketch of this victim, of what she possibly looked like in life, that was impossible because she had been decapitated, and still to this day, her skull has never been found. Their goal at this time was to pinpoint as many traits that defined her, but they would be completely incorrect when it came to a very crucial one, and that was her race. They believed her to be a white woman, when in actuality, many years later, they would discover she was actually a black woman. This could have been a huge reason why it took so long to finally identify her. One of the first things they did in the attempt to discover who she was run her fingerprints through different databases. Unfortunately, despite their dedicated efforts, the search for her identity yielded no substantial results because there was no match in the FBI database or with authorities in Texas or later Arizona. Despite the efforts of authorities to spread awareness about the murder, no one seemed to come forward with information about the woman's identity. The lack of cooperation from the public further complicated the investigation and contributed to the case going cold. Without any potential leads to follow, the chances of solving the case diminished significantly. They still held hope though. After a long and frustrating 7.5 months, a new discovery was made a little over 700 miles west that made them feel like they may finally get somewhere in this case. On October 2nd of that year, in a rural desert of Scottsdale, Arizona, hunters camping east of Pima Road and north of Bell Road came across a skull with a missing jawbone. The Maricopa Sheriff's Office were informed of the findings and began their own investigation into the identification of their unknown deceased individual. One who they also believed to be a homicide victim based on the condition of the skull. There was a 5-inch fracture near its base that was guessed to be due to blunt force trauma, but they couldn't rule it out being because of a fall and then maybe the skull being dragged to a different location because of animals later on. There were gnaw marks on the skull as well from wildlife. Maricopa County Sheriff's spokeswoman Myrna Froning did state that a jawbone had been located in that same area back in February of that same year, and after an examination, it was discovered the jawbone did belong to this skull. The skull was guessed to have come from a woman in her late teens to early 20s. Authorities would end up ruling out roughly 120 missing women as being their Jane Doe. Then they were reached out to by the Lubbock Police Department back in Texas regarding the remains they found in February, the same month that the jawbone was located in Scottsdale. Forensic pathologist Ralph R. Erdman examined the skull and the skeletal remains, and he stated that he was 95% certain that they belonged to the same woman. He based his conclusion on the post-mortem intervals of the two. Both seemed to have been deceased the same amount of time, and he stated the bones in fact matched up. This, though, would be a huge mistake in this case, in both cases. They didn't know that at the time, and they trusted Erdman, and the two sets were eventually buried together in a cemetery in Plainview under the name Jane Doe. Let's take this now to 1983, the year after both remains were found. Authorities again thought they possibly had a huge breakthrough in this case. That deceptive revelation in the investigation stemmed from a false confession from a man who went down in history as the serial killer with the most of them, Henry Lee Lucas. Henry Lee Lucas, after being convicted of killing two of his victims, Becky Powell and Kate Rich, was asked about hundreds of other murders, and he kept giving false confession after false confession. He would be indicted for many other murders, including the murder of the Jane Doe in discussion today. The Jane Doe from Hale County, who at the time they thought was also the one found in Scottsdale. He would later recant this confession, along with many others, and would be convicted in total of 11 murders. It is suspected, though, he was involved in quite a few others as well, but this has never been proven legally. That information possibly died with him when he took his last breath behind bars on March 12th of 2001 due to congestive heart failure. In the end, he was ruled out as being the culprit in this case. The investigation reached yet another impasse, and it wouldn't be the last. Remember Ralph R. Erdman, the forensic pathologist I mentioned before, who stated the remains of Hale County Jane Doe and the remains of the Scottsdale Jane Doe were the same individual? Well, in 1992, he would be convicted of falsifying autopsy reports. Yep. It all began a year before when the son of one of the men Ralph did an autopsy on started questioning his findings. Ralph had done a full autopsy on a man named Robert Craig Newman, and in this autopsy, he put down the weights of both the man's spleen and gallbladder. Robert's son stated that this made no sense because his father's spleen had been removed years prior to his death. The remains of Robert were exhumed, and it was discovered that an autopsy was never actually conducted on his remains. After this conviction, it was discovered that this was not the first time the pathologist had done this. Another woman who he was hired to perform an autopsy on had never had one performed on her body either. At first, it kind of looked like a case of incompetence, but it would be discovered to be more so a case of complete corruption. In another case, he had actually lost the head of a woman, with her head being the main form of evidence considering it was where the bullet wounds were. Since her head was missing, the case against the suspected murderer had to be dropped. In a separate incident, a man endured several months of incarceration due to his alleged involvement in the death of his infant son. However, it was discovered that the tragic incident was an accidental drowning, that the man had no involvement. He sued, and Lubbock County had to pay the man $15,000 for wrongful imprisonment. He was only imprisoned due to the investigative work of Ralph R. Erdman. Lastly, a man named Johnny Lee Ray had spent 2 years on death row due to a testimony from Ralph back in 1990 that turned out to be false as well. In 1995, Ralph R. Erdman was indicted for charges of perjury and tampering with evidence. He would be sentenced to 10 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and on top of that, he was fined $17,000 for all of the botched autopsies he performed and later exhumations that had to be performed because of his deception. An entire story on the show 60 Minutes would be done on this Texas autopsy scandal. After all of this was discovered, authorities started looking back on the case of the Jane Doe from Hale County. The remains wouldn't be exhumed, though, for years to come, not until 2015. The remains were dug up by Texas Rangers and sent off to the Center for Human Identification at the University of North Texas, and it was finally proven that the skeleton from the neck down and the skull and jaw were actually from 2 separate individuals. Again, a huge mistake in a case because of Ralph R. Erdman. Years later, the DNA Doe Project began helping with the case and offered to test the remains. We've talked about the DNA Doe Project many times here on my channel, but it is a non-profit organization that uses genetic genealogy to identify John and Jane Does, along with the identity of victims' killers. They would come to the conclusion that the race of Plainview's Jane Doe was actually African American. In November of 2022, Plainview Jane Doe's identity would be discovered, but it wouldn't be until early June of this year, last month, that the news was finally released to the public. In life, the Jane Doe was 20-year-old Debra Denise Mackey. She also used the last name Terrell. She was from Lubbock. Yes, the same area she would later be found in. She was a young mother described as fun-loving, but lived life fast. The last time her family saw her, she was ringing in the new year of 1982 at her mother's home. At around 2 in the morning, she was reported leaving the residence of her mother's in a brown vehicle with an unknown individual. This was the last time her family ever saw her. Debra's missing persons case was reopened by Lubbock police in 2016. And mostly due to them not getting the race correct of the Jane Doe back in 1982, they never considered the Jane Doe as possibly being her. Years back, Debra's cousin Mary would tell a reporter, "That's a part of my life that will never go away until we find out whatever ever happened to her. Never saw her again, never knew what happened to her. We remember she came and she had on a brown coat. She came in and something crazy happened. She left and we never saw her again. It's killing us, each and every day, a little bit by a little bit. It's taking some parts of us." She went on to say, "Still hold on to the same little memory. There's no way in the world that she would have left and never came back." Back at the beginning of her disappearance, there was a theory that possibly Debra just walked away from her life and started anew somewhere else, but her family never believed that. Debra's sister, Angela Terrell, was quoted saying, "We loved my sister. She was a people person. She got along with everybody. Everybody got along with her. I didn't even know of one enemy that she had." Angela stated, "We have our suspicions about what happened to her. She didn't just jump up and leave because she loved us and her only child." A missing persons report was in fact filed for her not long after she vanished. Her family never gave up on her. All they wanted for so long was closure and to give her a proper burial if she actually had been deceased. They are, of course, able to do that now, but this case is not over yet. Whoever her killer is, even over 41 years later, is possibly still out there alive. That is why authorities are asking for help from anyone who may know anything regarding her senseless murder. Anyone with information about the case is asked to call Crime Line at 806-741-1000, and you could be eligible for a reward up to $5,000 if the responsible party is identified or arrested. We also have to remember that the Jane Doe from Scottsdale back in 1982 is still unidentified to this day. I will post a link down below from uncovered.com that is in partnership with the Doe Network, where you can contribute to her case to hopefully help her be identified. This is another one of those cases where I hope to eventually come back on my channel and do a part 2, whether that be the Jane Doe from Scottsdale being finally identified or Debra's killer finally being identified. Like with all of my videos, leave any of your thoughts or opinions about the case or cases in this sense down below in the comments, and leave some love down in the comments as well for the loved ones of today's victim. If you have any cases that you possibly want me to cover, make sure to send those over to gabulouscaserequests@gmail.com, and I will see you all in the next one.